I'm really excited to be here with you and to share some of my thoughts about understanding time in relationship to politics. I'll be talking a lot about Egypt, but I'll once in a while be referencing the situation here in the United States. One of the things I think that we can do to understand what's going on in the United States is to look at what's happened in other parts of the world which have also undergone really radical social change of the kind that we've undergone in the United States over the past 15 years, and to sort of see what happened in those places and to reflect on what that means for us here. So I'll bring us back to 2011. This is a picture of Tahrir Square in Egypt. This is the night of the fall of the dictator in 2011, Hosni Mubarak. This came after 18 days of a mass uprising of millions of people in the streets, trying to get rid of this authoritarian dictator and trying to fight for freedom and human dignity. This was part of, I'm seeing a lot of younger faces in the crowd, so I'm going to give general background on the Arab Spring. This was part of what became known as the Arab Spring. These were a set of uprisings in 2011 that swept across the Middle East and started really in Tunisia in January 2011, when millions of people went to the streets there and deposed also a decades-long dictator. Then it spread to Egypt in late January, January 25th, the protests started. Those lasted for 18 days and resulted in the overthrow of President Hosni Mubarak, who'd been in power since 1981. And then quickly spread to other countries like Yemen and Syria and Jordan and Morocco, and Bahrain. So many countries across the region experienced these mass uprisings, which came to be known as the Arab Spring. Now, this was a term that was sort of invented by Western media sources to name all of these uprisings that were happening. And I just want you to pay attention to this phrase. It's very interesting. So it implies a kind of a spring after a winter, right? It's like, it has to do with like the seasons. There's a spring. So what happened before the spring? It sort of makes you think, come on in, there's seats over here. Maybe we could pull some of those seats down. So it has a kind of implication that there was a kind of Arab slumber before this spring, that somehow Arabs were like asleep and hibernating in the winter. And then suddenly they woke up and there was a spring. And of course, this relates to all sorts of stereotypes about Arabs and Muslims in the West as being somehow kind of asleep or backward or not quite with the times, right? So already there's senses of time and space, like the Arab world and the spring and slumber, already in the ways that Western media came to define these uprisings. When the uprisings hit, people both in the Middle East and outside in the West were saying things like, no one expected this. No one expected this. This is extraordinary. It's amazing. And what's interesting about these phrases is they kind of also emphasize that notion that perhaps there was, this just happened, this came out of nowhere, right? And that Arabs were kind of like asleep until these uprisings that happened that were extraordinary, not ordinary, right? And that no one could have expected this. And then, in the wake of the uprisings, there was what many came to call the Arab Fall. We're moving through all the seasons here. So winter, I guess there was no summer. It's kind of always the summer in the Middle East, it's so hot. But the Arab Fall, which is the kind of results of many of these uprisings, have been not what the people hoped for, right? In Syria, there's a civil war. The uprising was brutally suppressed in Bahrain. In Egypt, we now have a new military authoritarian regime in power. Libya is practically a civil war at this point. So what happened to the Arab Spring? Here's just a couple of images related to sort of what happened in Egypt, and I'll be going through the timeline a little more concretely with you. But this image on the left is an image of a bunch of corpses, bodies, in a mosque. These were victims of state violence. The Egyptian government, so right after the revolution, the leader was deposed, and there were many different processes that led to a presidential election. a candidate who was affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a major organization in Egypt, has been around for many decades. He won the election, but in the course of the first year of his term, he did not rule effectively in the viewpoint of many Egyptians, including those who voted for him. And so many people went to the streets the year after his election in 2013 and demanded that he leave. They thought, we got rid of Mubarak, we can get rid of this other person, Mohamed Morsi. And what happened was a military general rose. His name is Sisi, S-I-S-I. He rose to power, and he said, if you, people in the streets, sort of give me the okay, then I will take control of the situation and depose this guy. And that's what happened. So a military coup got rid of this democratically elected president. Well, his supporters were not happy with that, obviously, and so they staged another camp out in the streets for a few weeks, and they demanded the return of their democratically elected president. The military regime started to basically stoke fear in the population and say, oh, these are Islamists, they're scary, they're like ISIS, even though they're not affiliated with ISIS. They want to turn Egypt into Islamic State, and here they are in the streets protesting to have their president back. You need to support us to get rid of these protesters. And the majority of the people, and these are people that were out in the streets 2 years prior in the revolution, said okay, basically. And the military regime went in on August 14, 2013, and murdered 1,000 Egyptians who were in the square demonstrating for the return of their president. I'm not supporting the president at that time. He was not a good president, but it was the single largest massacre in a single day in the modern Middle East. Okay, so that happened. That's sort of partly what happened to the revolution. And this very small graphic, tells another side of what happened. And this is the percentage of Egypt's population under the poverty line, starting around 2011 and going up to 2017. And you can see it's rising. It's now 30%. The poverty line, the international poverty line, is about $2 a day. So 30% of Egyptians are living at $2 a day. And another 20% are living at around $2 a day. So that's 50%, 30 living under $2 and 20% living at $2. So it's 50% of the population living on nothing, basically. So what happened? Many observers will point to this kind of evidence that there was sectarianism or religious supporters versus secularists or religious versus the military, basically looking at religion. And others will look at the economy and economic indicators. I want to suggest another way. Those are both valid, partial explanations of how we understand what has happened. But I want to suggest another way for how we understand what happened to those uprisings and how we understand what is happening now. And fortunately, this series on time and on slow work has me thinking a lot about time. If we think about time and how people experience time and how they experience time in space, I know this seems really abstract right now, I'll bring it down. How they experience time in particular spaces, and then how they feel about that experience. If we look at those three things together, time, feelings, and space, I want to suggest it provides us another way of thinking about political change. I'm an anthropologist. I'm interested in what everyday people do in the world, and my experiences of Egypt, doing research there in the years leading up to the revolution, during the revolution, and after the revolution, suggest to me that we can better understand political change at a grassroots level by paying attention to time, feelings, and space, and especially how they interact. And if we do that, I think that we can kind of get out of some of the obvious explanations for why change stalls or why change happens. And some of you may be thinking that things need to change here in the United States. Some of you may be happy that a recent change has occurred with the election of Trump. Some of you may be shocked and unhappy about that. Those are feelings that you have related to the particular space and time that you're in. So if you think about that, that can maybe tell you where we're going or how maybe change could occur or opposition or protest could occur. So going back to 2011, these are the protests, the main kind of slogan was bread, freedom, and dignity. Aish, horiya, karama, insaniya. That's what people said in the streets over and over again and protested over and over again for bread, freedom, and human dignity. What does this mean? Why bread? Bread has been incredibly important in many of the protests across the Middle East, but in Egypt in particular. There's seats, two up here. Come on up. In Egypt in particular, because it's seen to symbolize dignity and being treated with dignity. Bread is the main staple of every meal. It's what people put on the table at every meal. And if they don't have enough money to buy bread, they don't have enough money to buy the staple of their existence, that's a real assault on human dignity. There were other aspects of losing human dignity that were really infuriating Egyptians to bring them to the streets. These had to do with, search, what do we call it here? Frisk and search, like not illegal kind of attacks by the police, illegal detentions, torture, those kinds of things that were believed to be assaults on human dignity are in fact, and freedom, the fact that they had, the same president for 30 years. But it wasn't like they were asleep for decades and just suddenly realized they didn't have these things. We can look back at least to 1977, if not actually to anti-colonial protests in the 50s. In 1977, there were 3 days of bread riots in Egypt as a result of the government normally has provided subsidies for bread so that people can put bread on the table. But they tried to lift the subsidies entirely in 1977 as a result of pressure from the United States and international lending organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Egyptians said, we're not having it. They went out into the streets in the millions and put a stop to this, and they had to bring the subsidies back. So there were already bread protests. There's already like a culture of protest in the streets, anger as a feeling, protest in the streets, and a feeling of, no, we're not going to take this. Our future has to have, access to affordable food, going back to 1977. But those subsidies started to decrease. The government would shave them a little bit year by year. And that put a huge economic crisis on people, especially in the 2000s. In the years leading up to 2011, this is the title of my talk today, there was a sense that we need to speed up, especially among the youth. There was a sense that Egypt is not keeping up with the rest of the world, that we need to speed up and do more to make our society the way we want it to be. And one saw this in youth initiatives. One saw this in protest culture. For example, and for anyone that was paying attention, there were over 3,000 labor strikes from 2006 to 2011. 3,000 strikes in factories across the country. Not just factories, but also professionals like doctors were on strike, teachers were on strike, iron and steel workers were on strike. And you can see how bread became a symbol in those protests. They were on strike for higher wages, a living wage, basically, their own Fight for 15, if you've heard of that movement here. They were on strike for safe working conditions. They were on strike to not have temporary contracts, but rather like a year-to-year contracts, but rather more guaranteed 3 to 5 year contracts. So over 3,000 strikes arguing for bread and human dignity, trying to speed things up. We can't wait anymore. The government keeps saying they'll give us a raise next year, but we can't wait anymore. This corporation says, things are tight and they can't afford this and that. We can't wait anymore. So 3,000 strikes. If people were looking, there was no slumber, right? Fights for freedom. There were a couple of movements in 2004 and 2008. I won't go into detail into them, but they were basically student movements and kind of leftist intellectual movements. They would go out in the street and protest along with the strikers sometimes on their own. And they were arguing a lot for freedom of the press and also freedom of elections, not wanting to, have the same government in power every year. All these old guys, in their perspective, in power for life. There were a lot of also grassroots organizations, lots of what we call NGOs, non-governmental organizations, opening in the droves in the early 2000s leading up to 2011. And I did a lot of research on arts organizations that opened. So this is one NGO that opened to to basically advance social change through the arts in a poor neighborhood. So they would target kids and teach them arts and teach them kind of like values and values of democracy and values of entrepreneurship through the arts in these neighborhoods. So there were many, many of them. And for those of you that read the abstract for this talk, I was going to talk mostly about them, but I'm not because it evolved in a different way. But I want to show you another kind of arts organization that opened, just to give you a sense that some of these ideas about, it's the religious people, the Islamists versus the secularists, that binary didn't really make sense in the years leading up to 2011. This was a grassroots organization founded by a group of Islamists, and they were really into the arts. And they thought we could sort of help kids. This is one of the celebrations they do for artists, or basically a project orphans, not artists, a project targeting orphans and teaching orphans sort of basic life skills through the arts. And they were doing this to help orphans and also to become sort of better Muslims. And that was part of their project of making a better society. So those kinds of distinctions didn't really make sense. Everyone was trying to speed up. Everyone was trying to, here's another activity they did. This isn't just with orphans. These were with poor and working class youth, also teaching them sort of values through the arts. And you can see some of here the young leaders of the organization. Another really famous NGO that was founded in those years trying to speed things up was an NGO called El Rasala. They also were an Islamically oriented NGO, and they did a lot of public works projects here. They're cleaning up the streets. They did a lot of educational projects, giving kids after school extra help with their homework, stuff like that. So again, the kind of religious secular binary doesn't make sense here. Everyone was trying to speed things up and to become what people would call like a modern civilized society that doesn't have this decrepit government and lack of freedom. So that's what led people to the streets in 2011. There was already a sense of time that we need to do something. We need to do it faster. And so people took that sense of time, and that was sort of in the atmosphere, right? And so then people were like, as protests started to happen on the streets on January 25th of 2011, people were like, it just fit into what they were already doing, right? Going out in public and doing things, going out in public space, trying to advocate for change. And you can see in some of the graffiti, I want to see another president before I die. This is graffiti from Tahrir Square. That time was really important to people. If you were born anytime after 1980, you'd only seen one president in your entire life. So, there was a sense of, wait, my life cannot go by without change happening. Time was really important, and announcing kind of this expectation of a utopian future in public space was really important. Here's another one, antique dictator for sale. He's old. I'm going to sell him. So, an Egyptian anthropologist named Hanan Sabah talked about Tahrir, those 18 days, as a time out of time. And anyone who was there, including myself, who experienced this, can tell you it felt like a time out of time. It truly was extraordinary. It was as if all of the ways of thinking about time that were backward and we're not caught up, or we need to catch up, all of those things were suspended, and people were living their ideal world. They were living the utopia of the revolution, right? And I just want to show a part of music video that was made in Tahrir during the protests to give you a sense of how the community formed during the protest, in a sense that everyone sort of got along and cooperated with another, distributing food, distributing medical supplies. There was even a library set up where you could go and read about revolutions if you wanted to. People that had stores and homes around the square would walk around and say, does anyone need to use my restroom? Does anyone, I mean, it was kind of amazing. There was like adequate restroom provision. So people were really taking care of each other and modeling the society they wanted to see in Egypt. So this is by a group called Karaoke. It's like karaoke. It's kind of a joke, but called Sound of Freedom.
نزلت وقلت أنا مش راجع وكتبت بدمي في كل شارع سمعنا اللي ما كانش سامع واتكسرت كل الموانع سلاحنا كان أحلامنا وبكرة واضح قدامنا من زمان بنستنى بندور مش لاقيين مكاننا في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي رفعنا راسنا في السماء والجوع ما بقاش بيهمنا أهم حاجة حقنا ونكتب تاريخنا بدمنا لو كنت واحد مننا بلاش ترغي وتقول لنا نمشي ونسيب حلمنا وبطل تقول كلمة أنا في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي في كل شارع في بلادي صوت الحرية بينادي
حياتي مصرية سمرة ليها في التمييز.
So you can see there we go, that notions of time and space and feelings came together, right, and created this protest, this sense of the streets are ours. In every street in my country, people are together asking for freedom. It was really a time out of time where space and feelings and the sense of now is the time really came together. Of course, it didn't last very long, but one of the things that really became important, a sense of time in Tahrir Square, was this notion of waiting, but not waiting with like being fed up, but waiting with excitement and humor, waiting for the president to leave office. So for, as it became clear around day 11, day 12, that people were not going to go home, and they were going to try and make this utopia that they were experiencing permanent. They were just waiting for the president to realize that, basically. And so Egyptians are known throughout the Middle East for being really, really funny people, and I think it's a generally true stereotype. So they started to do signs related to waiting. You're definitely going to have to leave. Just do it so I can go get a haircut. I don't know if you can see, but he's got kind of long hair. Come on, leave, my hand hurts. That's what his sign says. Basically, his hand hurts from holding the sign for so long. So humor, which we can think of as producing a kind of feeling of joy and a feeling of lightheartedness. Like, yes, we're doing this really important political work, but we're sustaining ourselves. I mean, you can't be like serious and protesting for 18 days. The humor helped people sustain themselves in the square. And then on February 11th, he stepped down, and it was an experience that is actually indescribable. I called my parents in the middle of running down to Tahrir Square to join the celebration. I said, it's the best day of my life. And my husband looked at me and was like, what about the day we got married? This is so much more exciting. This is about a moment in world history. Maybe our marriage will someday be thought of that way, but I don't think so. But then very quickly, utopias don't last, right? Revolutions often take a while. That's part of my message today. And people started to say, okay, we got him out of office. And some people were like, okay, well, now we need to, change the Constitution, and we need to get all these other people out of power. It's not just about the president. We need to, do this and do that. And there was this whole set of demands. And other people in the crowd, other people in Tahrir were saying, wait, we're moving too fast. We're moving too fast. You were trying to speed up, but now we're moving too fast. We need stability. And that became the main discourse in the 2-3 years after the uprising in 2011, and it's still pretty prominent, this notion of stability. Don't move too fast, okay? And you may kind of hear resonances of this in the American public sphere as well. So what did stability mean? Is people were like, we can't spend all of our day in the square. We can't occupy the square, ad infinitum. We have jobs, we have lives, we have things we have to go do. And we can't constantly have, police attacking us and tear guns and the military police. I mean, there's several different kinds of police in Egypt. We need a sense of stability and to see where we're at. And the military regime, which was in power for a brief moment before that Islamist president was elected, they agreed and they started to build walls. So wall building is a theme of our times, shall we say. And you see it around the world. These were walls that were quickly erected by the military regime in streets in many of the major cities, including in Cairo, to prevent protesters from gathering in space. It was an attempt to control space. And these are major streets. It'd be like putting a wall on Lomas or Manal Avenue, and suddenly you're like, how do I get where? And that produces frustration, right? So people were getting very frustrated. This is another big wall that went up. This was also in downtown Cairo, and some artists decided, you know what, you're not going to put these walls up and make us not remember the street that once was. And so they did this trompe-l'oeil piece of art here so that people could sort of remember how life should be instead of accepting these walls as a kind of fact of life. Just as an aside, this is the American University in Cairo, which is a place where many people have learned Arabic over the years. And myself, I learned Arabic in this classroom here. So this was kind of a major deal in downtown Cairo. Here's another wall. And again, to sort of muddy up this kind of distinction in the American news anyway about secularists versus Islamists, I wanted to show you this graffiti, which is a verse from the Quran that an artist painted on the wall. And it's basically a verse that says we need to keep persisting, right? So there was constantly this kind of interplay between, you started to have this faction that wanted stability and slow things down, another faction that was like, wait, we're really frustrated. Maybe we do need a little stability, but not to the degree of walls in our streets. Humor still was important. This cartoon, this guy's saying to the other one, I feel like the country will be stable soon. And of course, the government's about to sit on the everyday people. So this led to, as we're getting into now 2-3 years after the uprising, frustration, people being fed up, and a very, very important feeling that was produced because people felt that, well, what happened to the revolution? I mean, some of us want things to go faster. Some of us said we need stability, but we want some change. And also frustration of being fed up because of this control of space. The government passed a protest law making it illegal to protest. They established an emergency law, which is still in effect, which basically controls many people's movement through space. This graffito I thought was really interesting. I saw this in 2013. This says, "Where is the bread?" And I took it above, it's where this shoeshine guy sits, one of the many people living on less than $2 a day. And he said to me, all the foreigners take pictures of this over my head. I don't know why. I'm like, well, because it's pretty symbolic, right? Still, there is no bread. And then people started to look at other spaces, namely outside of Egypt. and say, wait a second, Syria could be our future. Because at this point, Syria was really devolving. ISIS taking over large portions of the territory of Syria, major civil war between different factions. As we now know, the largest refugee crisis in the 21st century, hundreds of thousands of deaths. People said, even people that were hardcore revolutionaries were like, wait, we don't want to become Syria, right? So let's have this military dictator come to power, kick out the Islamist president that I told you about, and then this Sisi was elected president in 2014, a year after that massacre. And many people thought that he was a savior. Here's a cartoon from the newspaper. Don't be surprised, this isn't an American film. This is Sisi man, the President Sisi, who saved Egypt before she fell down. He's going to save Egypt. So he was really viewed as a savior, but he's a military general, just like the prior president was. The military regime still controls at least 50% of the Egyptian economy, still controls the massive military police force that maintains control over space, that tortures and detains and imprisons. So people are kind of caught now in between different senses of time. I'll get to that in a minute, but just to give you a sense of where things stand right now in Egypt, 50% of people at or below the poverty line, 30% inflation, 60,000 political prisoners now, many forced disappearances, including of college students, torture of detainees, 7,400 military trials for civilians, no jury, shutdowns of press and social media, shutdowns of many NGOs, including some of the arts NGOs that I worked with. Just a note on this forced disappearances, students who protest or who either in public protests or do kind of actions against the university administration can be sitting in class one day, police come to the door, picked up out of class, never seen again. Sometimes their tortured body found on the side of the road. So this regime has these 60,000 political prisoners, that's since the uprising. So this is recent. And 30% inflation, it's just really unbelievable. People are not able to afford basic amenities. So right now, a lot of people are asking in Egypt, well, what was it all for? And where do we go from here? What does future look like when we thought our future was this amazing utopia? And there's been a couple responses to this, and guess what? They have to do with notions of time. One is nostalgia. A large portion of the population, mostly middle class, mostly in the cities, have started to say, we shouldn't have done it. Let's go back to the time before the revolution. Mubarak was fine. You know, it was fine. At least we knew what we were getting into. Now we're like afraid we're going to turn into Syria, right? Many of those same people also have fear of the future. Fear, intense fear that radical Islamic terrorists are going to come and take over the country. This is a fear that has been stoked by the regime, going back to the 1990s, actually. They say you want democracy? Well, if you have democracy, ISIS might come and run your country because they'll be let in because you won't have this strong military protecting your country. You won't have these strong walls. If any of this is sounding familiar, it should. This discourse of fear and people's real feelings of fear have produced a certain kind of politics in Egypt today. Fear of an other, fear of Islam, fear of actually also refugees and immigrants from Syria coming into Egypt. Many of those people, and also a lot of the youth and revolutionaries also talk about feeling frozen in time. So a colleague of mine is the head of the Associated Press in Cairo, and he just sent me this message when I asked him about people's sense of time right now, because I wanted right now to give this to you, what people are feeling. And he said, there's a sense that there's nothing anyone can do. Everything is just frozen for now. People may suspect that things will change in the future, but they have no idea what that change will be or who will carry it out and whether it would be for better or worse. So there's nostalgia, there's fear, there's a sense of being frozen in time that is, shared by many different groups in the population. And I think that this has to do with tensions in the experience of time. Like during the revolution, in the uprisings and the years before the uprisings, there was this sense of unilinear time. We're moving towards a utopian future and we will get there. Then Mubarak was deposed. And then, wait, there's reality. And reality doesn't work unilinearly, right? It's messy. You know, you can have fits and starts, progress here, things not happening there, you know? So it's these different senses of time, one sort of more realistic and in the present, and one more future-oriented that is causing, I think, a lot of these feelings of being frozen. But I want to give you a couple quotes from a young Egyptian activist, which I think give us a sense of how time is being rethought right now. And he says, on January 24th, this is the day before the protests, 2011, there seemed to be no future. That was an error in judgment on the part of a great many, caused by the blinding darkness of the state of affairs at that moment. I've learned to read the present a bit more carefully and with a much less defeatist attitude to avoid that mistake that many of us made. I would say that I still have a realistic expectation of better prospects for Egypt's future. So he's saying, you never know. We can have another mass uprising again, but regardless, realistically in the present, we shouldn't be defeatist. There are things that are happening. He says, I saw the hundreds who protested under Mubarak turn into thousands. And most any young Egyptian who tries to find out the truth about politics will find revolutionaries to speak with, even if they seem to be defeated. How can we not also see the numbers of young students who are mobilizing every day, at least in terms of expressing their opinions and rejecting the present rule? This is the future. Just observing them keeps the future in sight. So I think a lot of activists like Wael Iskandar here are feeling like they have a more realistic sense of the present, but they still have that future in sight because of the memory of the past and what they accomplished in 2011. And when he's talking about protests, there have been protests this year. These were, the government lifted subsidies again on bread in March, and there were mass protests around the country. There's been student protests. This is student protests from March 2017 against the forced disappearances from colleges. There's also still a lot of grassroots action. If you look outside the cities and you look outside the squares, you can see this. This is from a small village in southern Egypt. It's like barely on a major map of the city that you would, the country that you would find. And this is a group of youth that got together, formed an organization, and here they basically collected money to build roofs on houses of the poor. That poor people often don't have roofs, right? Which is awful in the sun. And so here they are building roofs. Here they are having basically a session for, it was like a celebration for children to teach them about their rights, their political and economic rights. And they also had a bread distribution plan, which they actually pressured the local governor to give them money instead of the money going in the governor's pockets as corruption, to give them money to distribute bread to the poor. So there's still a lot going on, but you have to look outside the spaces of the main squares. And you have to think about time a little differently, not just as like the revolution is something that happened in the past. So like I said, people are feeling the tension between different notions of time and space. And they're understanding that political work is hard, and it happens in many different spaces, and it happens not always just in one unilinear fashion. And so the main message, I think, from Egypt today that relates to this series, this international studies series that you have, is that revolution is slow work. And I think that's what many people are coming to realize. So I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
First, I want to invite Dr. Emma Trenman to come up, who, if you don't know, she's a professor of Arabic here in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures. And I just want to invite her to make a few comments initially.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Winegar, for this wonderful presentation. As someone who's also followed the Egyptian Revolution with interest, I found this to be kind of fascinating, especially coming from my own background, not so much studying the revolution, but living in Egypt before that, and during the revolution, and then during current political events in the US, often feeling like I was back in Egypt. during 2011, and I thought this was a very interesting idea, and I felt like I could really see it among people I knew and friends. This idea of needing to speed up and catch up to the modern world, and then expressed like that, and then at the same time remembering those days in Tahrir, and then the sense of needing more stability and wondering what had happened and where this was going, which is actually something that, as you alluded to, I think we do see worldwide. There's this sense that we're sort of not sure where we're going, and things are very unstable, and that's very scary for a lot of us. And so there is sort of this recourse into nostalgia for various periods in time. Perhaps the days in Tahrir, perhaps days before that, and specifically referring to Egypt. I've heard nostalgia for almost every decade, depending on what you're nostalgic for, even whether it's the king or Nasser, one of the first presidents, or later periods, or for particular lifestyles, or particular, and I think we see that in the United States and in many other areas too. And so I think this is something that if we think about, and perhaps even if we're just aware of the tensions that we have ourselves experiencing place and time, and what we're being nostalgic for, or what we're afraid of, and what that says about us, and where we are going from this period of instability. I think if we think about those questions, even if we don't know the answers, knowing that we're thinking about them can be very useful for our political action, whatever your political viewpoints are. And so I don't want to go on too long because I would love to get to your questions, but thank you very much. And now let's hear from all of you. If you have questions, I can keep asking them, but I'm sure you have more questions for our speaker. So.
First a comment, and that was that the 18 days in Tahrir Square, from the video and also from the description of how people worked collectively to help one another, to pass out food, medicine, etc., reminded me very much of the Occupy movement in the United States, which I think pretty much
The same time.
Yeah, and contemporaneously. My question is, just looking at power politics and global politics, and Middle Eastern politics, what could you say about, in terms of the, quote, Egyptian revolution, what could you say in terms of the reaction of and the role of, in my opinion, two very important international players, the United States and Israel?
Well, what's pretty interesting about the United States is that at first, the Obama administration did not support the revolution. Some of you who might be in the class tomorrow with your class, right? Will see. I have a slide of someone from Tahrir Square hanging a sign, holding a sign that says something like "Obama enough, Mubarak has to go," and it was a message to Obama because the Obama administration did not want to. Basically, the line with the U.S. government is we need stability in the Middle East, and the Egyptian regime under Mubarak was viewed as stabilizing the Middle East. It's the largest Middle Eastern country. It's the second largest military after Israel. Egypt is the only country that signed a peace accord with the State of Israel, the Camp David Accords. And so Egypt was, yes, that was later. Yeah, I mean, various countries have recognized Israel's right to exist, which Israel often purposefully forgets. But so basically, the administration did not support the revolution. But then when it became clear that this was a mass uprising and the administration would look kind of bad not supporting all these people out on the streets, came to support the revolution, but always played a role in kind of wanting to support the Egyptian military. Partly because of this stoked up fear of Islamists and partly because of the agreement with Israel. You should also know that Egypt is the second largest recipient of US foreign aid of any country. The first is Israel. So Egypt gets upwards of $4 to $5 billion a year of US taxpayer money to it's mostly military aid. Well, really what it is it's support for U.S. military manufacturers. Basically, they basically get this fund because it's given to Egypt to buy American military weaponry. So it's basically a subsidy for the American weapons industry. And then Israel gets the largest amount. So it's an incredible, decades-long amount of support for the Israeli and Egyptian militaries. So that kind of pushes against sort of people's political protest, right? But many of us said, at the time when the U.S. government is saying we need to keep stability, like we've had stability in the Middle East. There's been authoritarian regimes for 30 years. We don't need stability. That's what we do not need right now. But anyway, over the course of time, there have been, once in a while, the United States will withhold some of its foreign aid to Egypt, saying, wait, there's human rights abuses. This just happened recently. The Trump administration withheld some of that aid, but it's never the military aid. It's the $230 million of education aid and health aid. It's not the military aid. But then, the government does something and then the Americans say, okay, we'll give it to you. So the relationship currently with the Trump administration is sort of like how it was with the Obama administration, to be honest. It's not much different because these policies have been enacted for decades. The same. Israel wants to see a strong military leader in power. And to be honest, Sisi has done more ever than Mubarak or Morsi did in terms of preventing the transfer of food and medicine and some weapons between Egypt and Palestinians across the border. There's been a lot of oppression of Palestinians in Egypt. And also Sisi has largely succeeded, shockingly, in getting Egyptians to really not support the Palestinian cause, to see the Palestinians as sort of people who just can't pick themselves up by their bootstraps. They've really bought into this kind of narrative that the government has given them. A lot of Egyptians find the whole issue of Palestinian rights as a distraction, which is very different than how it used to be. I'll let you, because I don't know who's raising hands.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask, what type of government does Egypt have? Is it just a dictatorship, or do they actually have some form of parliament?
There's a parliament, yeah. There's 2 houses of parliament. There's a constitution. It's it calls itself a democracy. There are elections, but everything is rigged and everything is corrupt. So it's basically authoritarian.
So is it worse than it was before, or is it better?
I think it's worse than it was before, actually. Not that I'm nostalgic for the Mubarak era, but the experience of the instability, people's feeling about instability of the revolution and their fear of ISIS and Syria and turning into Syria has, I think, allowed the military regime to do things that the Mubarak regime would not have ever really, there would have been much more kind of protest. So in terms of shutting down the media, in terms of these forced disappearances, these political prisoners, and the problem is the media piece is really important because shutting down media outlets and surveilling people on Facebook and Twitter and arresting people based on that has really cast a pall on free speech. And you really need free speech to be vibrant in order to, create change and allow people to criticize policies in the government. So that's been really, really has made things a turn for the worse, I would say.
So I feel like you did a really good job separating the idea of radical Islam from just regular, everyday, practical Islam. And I feel like a lot of people kind of forget that it's not just us that are afraid, but it's people who practice Islam that are also afraid of the radicals. How do you recommend spreading that message instead of just, oh, we're afraid of the entire religion, but just we're afraid of the tiny piece of the religion that takes the common and different perspective?
I mean, I guess it depends on where you are in society, what kind of work you do, but I think reminding people just of the sheer numbers. There's over 1 billion Muslims in the world. No way that 1 billion people all think the same way, right? From 1 billion Muslims over 22 different countries, many different histories and branches of the religion, and reminding people that they're Muslims every day, that that are around. They're part of our daily lives, and they're not of the radical kind of bent. I think that's really important, especially here in the United States. The very first scout with the Spanish that came here to scout out basically colonizing this area of New Mexico was actually a Muslim from Morocco who'd been captured as a slave and then had been used as a scout in the New World. So Islam goes way back in the history of New Mexico, right? There's been Muslim communities that have lived here, up in Abiquiu, there's a mosque that people have moved here to practice Islam peacefully. So you can work at like a really local level, or you can remind people of like the vast number of Muslims in the world, and and also the accomplishments of Muslims, right? Doing amazing things. And a lot of people that you don't even know are Muslim, who are in our government and in our popular culture, who are not radical. Anyone watch Mr. Robot? That whole show is like staffed by Egyptian Muslims, including the lead character, winning Emmys and things like that. Yeah.
I have two questions. So first, I want to know, is there any logic to how Sisi was cracking on activists? Because it seems illogical at times. So he would crack up on certain popular activists, but he would leave another one. So it seems like illogical. It just seemed haphazard. So do you think that there is, he was kind of trying to play them or use emotions against them? That's the first one. The second one is there any emotional work to build up against the revolutionaries again? Because right now, even their posts on Facebook, and they're very down,
depressed.
It will never happen again. So is there any sort of emotional work that we could post on social media?
Okay, the first question is, so it was about Sisi sort of attacking different groups of activists, like leaving some and then attacking others. And it seems haphazard. Is there any logic behind it? A lot of observers, we don't know, I'm not in Sisi's mind or in his cabinet, but a lot of observers will say it's actually that haphazardness that is the logic, to create fear. So, for example, people may be allowed to like say whatever they want in a coffee shop one night, and then another night their friend gets arrested for saying something really minor, at a protest. And that kind of like, well, wait, how is this person speaking and that person is not speaking, that person's got arrested and this person didn't, is meant to create a sense of like, it's random, right? I myself haven't been back to Egypt for 1.5 years precisely because of that. I've written some things critical of the government, and I know some foreigners, well, one foreigner was brutally murdered, and others who were not allowed in the airport, and then others like get in and they like write on Facebook about the government. But it's that randomness that creates that fear. You never know when you're going to be attacked. So that's the first question. I think the haphazardness is part of the logic. The second question, emotional work, so many of the hardcore revolutionaries have decided, they're just going to live in the present moment and try and just live their lives. Others have gone into exile and are living a lot in Canada and the United States and Europe, kind of waiting for that moment again. I think that we're in a general moment in the world with the rise of right-wing kind of fascism, that people that are opposed to that feel like really depressed, and they don't have sort of like a plan of action. But I think being depressed can kind of be productive, because to be depressed means that you're not happy with the current situation. If you're just kind of like, oh, whatever, living your life, then that indicates that you're okay with the way things are going. So I've written actually little articles you can read online about the power of emotions, even negative emotions, in keeping an ideal alive. So if you're depressed because you want things to change. At least you want things to change. I realize that's not a great answer, but there's room for depression. Yes?
If we as Americans think that we have the right to, throw money at the fire and take away money at will, just kind of manipulate it in that way, then why don't we think we have the right to step in and defend these college is certainly when these activists who are screaming out for democracy and something that we believe is stable if we truly want stability there. Like what makes us think that we have the right to interfere so heavily
In one way.
in monetary means instead of actually, standing up for human rights.
Yeah, and the use of human rights by the U.S. government has kind of always been, whenever the U.S. government says we want to see better commitment to human rights in Egypt, it's not really backed up by any muscle. It's just a few $1 million, and it's not even the military, from the military budget, right? And I think it really has to do with the way that the U.S., I am not a U.S. expert, but the way that the U.S. has built its foreign policy around the world over many decades is not necessarily, it's for what is interpreted to be U.S. interests, economic interests and political interests, which is not necessarily the same as the interests of regular people in other countries. And you can find this Middle East, Latin America, and South Asia, Southeast Asia. I think it has to do with the U.S. government's conception of what is in U.S. interest, right? My ideal world would have a U.S. government that thinks that U.S. interest is when everyone around the world is living a life of dignity, right? But that's not always been the case. But you can write to Washington and tell them. There's other questions.
Hi, I want to ask something about you talk a lot about the experience of political time. I'm wondering in your observations, how's that intersecting with people's experience of personal time? Just now you mentioned that people still have aspirations about moving abroad or keeping their life moving. I'm wondering whether the experience of political time is having any effect on how people think about their personal futures.
That's a great question. I need to think about that a lot. I think what's really important to think about is where people are in their life cycle. So not all the people in Tahrir were young. There were a lot of senior citizens in Tahrir who were really mad at the loss of their pensions. So that's one myth that I want to kind of break down. But people that were young, right, they're between the ages of 18 and 25. They're in Tahrir protesting. This happens with the revolution. It kind of starts to falter. And that's at the same time when they're starting to think about getting married and having kids. So then they focus on that. And so I think in a way, for that generation, the experience of political time kind of slowing down and this move to stability coincided with a sense of personal time of, okay, now's the time to establish myself, get a real job, get married, have kids. So getting back to the other question about the emotions, I think it may depend on the generation right after them. Those that were 13, 14, 15, watching their older brothers and sisters in the square and are still, younger and don't have those life obligations yet. But I think you're right. There's something that needs to be thought about in the relationship between personal time and political time, and who has the time to protest, and who's in what life stage at where they can protest.
Go ahead.
First you, then you, then you. Okay.
Oh, is it me?
Yes, it is you.
Well, thank you for sharing the video and the artwork. And just in light of what all the research you've done through Creative Reckonings, I wondered if you might share more on what you're really seeing, possibly more initiative, or what is actually happening in the arts from your perspective that you're seeing?
Yeah, okay, so my main specialization is in the arts, and I'm sorry to talk too much about that, but what happened first of all, leading in the years up to 2011, there was a lot of the trying to speed up. People were opening artist-run galleries, artist-run collectives, just saw a whole flurry of arts activity, which wasn't just the State Museum and State Gallery. So that was huge. And starting to have a lot of street art, graffiti art, taking over of public space with these artistic and political messages. Then when 2011 hit, it was explosion of graffiti art. There's been a lot written about graffiti, and artists who had done sort of gallery-based art started to do more graffiti art. But then, right after Mubarak kind of left office, a lot of artists were like, what do we do now? We can't actually make art. We have to do important other work, and how do you express a revolution in art? I mean, we can do slogans and graffiti, but to do like a painting or a sculpture or video art about a revolution, it's like too large of a task. And also, a lot of artists would tell me to do a piece of artwork about the revolution is to like imprison it in a piece of artwork when they wanted it to be more kind of like active. I'm talking about visual artists now. So basically the music scene really, really hyped up. And now what we see is there's just massive growth in all of these amazing music groups. So visual artists are kind of, you know, they've returned to doing some political art, but the music scene has really, really become a huge space of political expression, of personal politics, of personal time, political time, and it's been a site of protest. So just last week, was it? There was a concert in a club by this group from, actually it was a group from Beirut, from Lebanon, and the lead singer is gay, and they're known to be a kind of a pro gay rights group. And a bunch of Egyptians went, and they were all excited. And it's kind of like part of this kind of like Middle East circuit of all these new hip young music groups. And some Egyptians raised the LGBTQ flag, the rainbow flag. And the images went viral. And the government has since arrested all of those people. Homosexuality is not against the law, but deviance is. And so it gets coded as deviant. And they've been arrested. And now, you know, they're targeting gay rights in Egypt right now. So you can see how the music scene becomes a site of both protest but also like surveillance. I could say a lot more, maybe we could talk after, but yeah.
Right, so you talk a lot about time like in terms of it being right for the revolution, like politically, economically, socially, but what about time like in the larger sense, so looking at technology, and in other words, like would a revolution like this have been possible before 2011, before platforms like Twitter existed?
Well, that's a great question. There was I think it was a Time magazine article when the 2011 uprising started, and they called it a Facebook revolution. And all of a sudden, people were like, Mark Zuckerberg created the Egyptian revolution, which was very insulting to all Egyptians. But technology played a super important role in creating communities of protest, both Facebook and Twitter, I would say, as well as blogs, leading up to 2011, and remained really, really significant, and have remained so significant, I would say, that that's why the government is now clamping down on closing certain sites, surveilling people's Facebook and Twitter accounts, and doing these random arrests and people that post political things. So technology has been really important, and it's especially in creating communities across different spaces, right? So that on January 25th, people in the far south of the country knew that there were going to be protests in the capital city, right? And then they could like join in or create their protests in the southern part of the city. But I think it's really important not to be sort of technologically determinist and sort of say that an upcoming revolution or even the 2011 revolution is solely due to these new forms of technology. Because on January 28th, the government, you were there, right?
Yes.
Shut off the internet and cell phones for 8 days, was it? There was nothing. They just shut it down. And the protests continued, and they grew. And they grew through traditional, like, well, TV was partly working, but traditional, like, word of mouth, people talking to each other, come down to the protests, activists knocking on doors of their neighbors. These old, you know, in the big towns where there's high labor movement action, like people, you know, unionists talking to their co-unionists come out and protest. So the kind of the older forms of organizing were still super important. I mean, even in the 8 days when there was no new media technologies. That was really scary. It's like, what? Do you think he was next?
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you so much for the talk. So we've talked a bit about technological time, personal time, and political time. I'd love to talk to you a little bit about spatial time. And by that I mean, when I think of the revolution in Egypt, I think of Cairo.
Yeah.
You know, and what does time mean in Cairo as opposed to in the countryside?
Right. Well, that's a great question. That's why I ended with a few images from that small village south of Cairo, because there, and it's another place where I do some research, this sense of time is really different. It's not a frenzied urban pace. They're like, you know, we've always been ignored by the government. We've always been ignored by even these youth revolutionaries in Cairo who think they're so awesome and that we're all backward. And we're just going to continue, you know, at this slow pace doing these projects and calling our local government officials to task for various things. So I think if we look outside of Cairo, actually we can see political action in places where you would least expect it. And I think that's true in the US. You look outside of DC or outside of the major cities, you can see political action, both left and right wing, right? In places where you least expect it. And I think that there's just a different kind of sense of what is possible. And there was less of a heartbreak because they've been so oppressed in rural areas for so long. They were like, okay, we made some incremental change. Now we can knock on the governor's office and, at least get a hearing, But that's a great question. Also within Cairo is really important. Not everybody was in Tahrir Square. I wrote a teeny little piece, also you can find online if you want, about work at home, revolutionary work in the home. So I had a small child, my son was very small at that point, and my husband was stuck outside of Cairo during the revolution, and so it was too dangerous for me to go to the square on some days, especially at night. So I was home in my apartment building with my neighbors, and we were cooking for people going to the square to deliver food, cooking for the men that were outside sort of guarding the area because there was no more kind of like regular police security in the area. Gathering funds from neighbors to buy medical supplies to send to those who were going to Tahrir. So a lot of that got ignored with this image of the revolutionary as a man in Tahrir. Well, there were women in Tahrir too, but there was a lot of women with kids at home doing political work. So I think it's important to look at space not just as public, but also like private and political. You had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, how is the government dealing with Islamists today?
Killing them, putting them in prison, torturing them, outlawing all of their activities, and propagating a discourse of fear that all Islamists are of the radical, violent variety, and they are coming to turn this country into Syria and to kill you all and take away all of your freedom of expression. Many of the the Muslim Brotherhood is pretty centrist, has traditionally been a pretty centrist movement, not like ISIS at all. They disagree with those guys. Many of them, the ones who are not killed or in prison, are in exile in various countries, often many in Turkey, actually. And you know what? They've turned a little bit towards violence. They're coming to support some violent actions. They're like, if they can kill 1,000 of us, then why don't we turn to violence? So this is the problem. You create this discourse of fear and paint people as terrorists and start killing them. There's blowback, and they may start to come kill you. And we see that with U.S. policy, the drone attacks around the world, killing many civilians who are not radical extremists. And, you birth, for every drone attack that kills like 80 farming families in Yemen, at least one relative is going to turn out to want to commit violence against the United States. So they're basically taking a page from the U.S. playbook and doing it really well. So.
We have time for one more question.
You in the front, you had your hand up a lot. Okay.
Oh, you need another question. You mentioned that the protesters were intergenerational, they weren't entirely young people. I'm wondering about the socioeconomic status of them.
Yeah.
Because of my impression, I would just guess they might have been more middle class, but maybe I'm wrong.
You can speak to this as well. So I think there was really a cut across social classes.
Okay.
There were the poor, the working class, middle class, even really well off, but people who just didn't want the same president in power and were sick of the clampdown on freedom of expression. It really cut across social classes.
And in terms of educational background, the same, would you say?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, for those 18 days.
For the 18 days.
Then afterwards, people educate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.